Okay, now I'm ready for painting the fur. I'm gonna do the fur first before doing the darker parts of the eyes because I wanna make sure that I'm doing the lighter parts of my dog first. So when I look at my reference photo, what I'll be painting is this yellow brown. Now I'm gonna be using a wet on wet technique, and I'm going to have a slightly larger brush that holds more water in order to have the lightest shade of yellow. I might leave some of these whites here that you see open, and then I'm gonna be dropping in, while the paint's still wet, dropping in some color on the darker areas. Now because my paint will dry faster than I can do the whole yellow of the face, I'm gonna be working in halves. So I'm gonna do this half first, and then once I've dropped in the darker colors, I'm gonna do this half. What I mean by darker colors is the darker browns. I'm not going to drop in any of the blacks just quite yet. I'm gonna do the blacks for last. So let's see how it goes. All right, so here I go. I'm gonna start with a wash over the entire part of the half of this face, and I'm only going to be doing until the places that have the yellow. So I'm gonna come in. You notice that I have a very light, the lightest shade that I can see on my dog here. And it's okay if I'm going over some of the marker. It will not bleed as much as you think it's going to bleed into the rest of your paint. All right, now this is the part that I see quite a bit of white. So I do want to leave some of that white. I'm going to mimic some of the hair. And now that I'm done, I'm going to simply re-wet to make sure that it's wet enough to work on. I'm going to clean my brush, and some of these edges here I'm going to lighten up slightly with a clean wet brush. I'm going to leave some of the edges the way that they were, but I do want to soften up some of them. And now I'm going to use my smaller brush, and I'm going to go in with a slightly darker brown, and I'm going to drop in some color where I notice some darker coloring. Now I'm doing all of this wet on wet because I don't want the color to be the lines to be very, very apparent. I'm still mimicking the fur. Using some darker colors within here. Now you can notice already that the color that I've put here is already dispersing quite a bit, which is good, but I'm gonna periodically be checking my reference photo to see if I need to drop in any more colors. darker browns and along the edge here as well. Now I'm not doing these hairs exactly how it looks in the reference photo because I am working fairly fast. I'm basically just using my reference photo as a guide for the hairs. I'm looking more at the overall tones and where there's a darker tone. Now that I have that, I'm gonna go in once again, clean up any of these blooms. If they're going in the way that I don't want them to go, I might soften up some of these lines, especially the ones that aren't going in the direction of the hair. But some of these lines I do want to leave. I don't want to completely soften all of them. The reason why I don't want to soften all of them is I do want to have some sharp details. It's going to help the overall look. But if I don't lighten anything, I find at least that there's too many details and the eye doesn't know exactly where to look. So like I said, I'm gonna keep some of these details here. I do really like how that detail looks. And I think I'm going to actually lift some of this paint from down here because I notice my reference photo that I went a little too dark down here. And I think I'm just gonna come in and clean up that line a little bit more, a little bit better. Okay, so that's what this side looks like. Let me show you the reference photo. So notice I kept some of the whites there, some of the whites here, but also notice that I did not look at any of the individual hairs here. Like I said, I started doing some of my own. I used the reference photos. I kept some of these lines sharp, and then I went in with a wet brush, and you notice that these hairs I did lighten and loosen up. That's gonna help you to have the overall look of a fur without having it look, without having to look for individual hairs. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the right side. If you noticed, once I got down here, it was actually drying up quite nicely. So that's why I only work in halves, because if I were to try to do the whole head at once, my paper would, my color would dry before I was able to actually get to the laying down the other color. So here we go with the right side. Okay, so I finished this side and I just wanted to show you some of the details. So remember how I'm blending out some of the sharp lines, but still keeping a few of the sharp lines to mimic the fur. I'm dropping in some darker colors while the paint is wet. Right here's another good example of while it was still a little wet, I took a wet, clean brush and grabbed some of that paint and softened the edges a little bit, but I left these edges a little bit more sharp. I'm dropping in paint and making sure that some of it is spreading, but yet I'm having some sharper lines. So for me as an artist, it's all about keeping some of this sharpness, but also blending some of it out. because I don't want it to be too overwhelming for your eye. When everything is sharp, it's almost too much information for your eye to take. So it's a mix of keeping it soft with wet on wet and keeping it sharp with a few different details. And that's how I do fur.
Stay tuned for next week's tutorial on next Tuesday, which will be looking at how to paint eyes. See you next week.